When the HOA drained my mountain lake claiming it was a flood risk, they didn't realize they were cutting off the lifeline that kept an entire county alive. They thought they were flexing power over one homeowner, but what they really did was trigger a disaster that exposed how little they understood the land they were trying to control. See, this story isn't just about an HOA, it's about arrogance, greed, and what happens when people in shiny boardrooms play God with nature's design. My name is Jack. I'm a civil engineer by trade and a man who thought he had finally found peace away from the city. I bought my mountain property 15 years ago, not for status or some fancy view but for purpose. There was an old natural lake right behind the ridge, fed by a spring that had been running since before the town was even founded. It wasn't just a body of water, it was the source that supplied a network of filtration channels and pipes leading all the way down to Clearwater County. It was quiet, humble, and pure, the kind of system that didn't need attention to prove it worked. When I moved here there was no HOA, just neighbors who minded their own business and looked out for each other. But like all peaceful things that last too long, someone somewhere eventually decides they can do better. A developer bought a bunch of cabins down the slope, turned them into vacation homes, and within 2 years the Clearwater Ridge Homeowners Association was born. They said it was to protect property value and preserve the mountain aesthetic, but really it was about control. At first it was the usual nonsense. Mailboxes had to be uniform, fences couldn't be taller than 4 feet, trash bins needed to be hidden from sight. I ignored most of it since my land sat higher up, technically outside their main jurisdiction, but the board president, a woman named Patricia Cole, better known to everyone as Karen Cole, didn't like that she couldn't control me. She'd show up in her spotless white SUV every few weeks, claiming that since the lake sat behind my property line it was technically shared resource property under the HOA's environmental clause. I told her politely that she was mistaken, that the lake was part of a federal conservation survey and listed as private, but she'd just smile that smug HOA smile and say, "We'll see about that." Fast forward to last spring, the snowmelt was heavy but not unusual. The lake swelled like it did every year, crystal clear and calm. One morning I saw heavy machinery on the far side near the access road. I drove down to find a crew setting up pumps and hoses. When I asked what they were doing, the foreman told me the HOA had ordered them to start draining excess water due to flood risk. My blood boiled. Flood risk? I said, the lake's been stable for 100 years. There's no floodplain anywhere near here. The man shrugged, said he was just following orders. I called Patricia right there. She picked up on speaker, all attitude. She said, "Jack, the board voted unanimously to approve preventative drainage last week after reviewing risk assessment data." I asked her what data. She said, "We had a consultant from the city." She replied, "He determined that the dam structure was outdated." I laughed because I designed that dam myself 15 years ago. When the county hired me for reinforcement work, I knew every bolt and barrier better than anyone. I told her the dam wasn't failing. The only thing at risk was her sense of authority. But she didn't listen. "They never do." The pumps roared on, and within hours the water line started to sink. I called the county office, but it was a weekend. No one picked up, so I drove to town and spoke to my friend Tom, who worked in environmental services. He checked the records and his face turned pale. "Jack," he said, "they didn't file any permits. You can't just drain a protected water source without clearance." I told him they were already halfway through it. He jumped up, grabbed his radio, and started making calls. By the time we got back, the pumps were still running. Patricia stood there with her clipboard, sunglasses, and fake concern. She said, "Jack, you're trespassing on HOA operation grounds." I said, "This isn't HOA property. This is federal land. You're interfering with municipal water infrastructure." She rolled her eyes, said, "Oh please, it's just a pond." That word, just a pond, something about it snapped in me. I walked straight to the control valve and shut the main pump off. She screamed at the crew to restart it, but I told them if they touched that valve again they'd be facing federal charges. Tom backed me up, flashing his credentials that made them hesitate, but Patricia wasn't done. She pulled out her phone, called someone, and whispered furiously. A few minutes later 2 sheriff deputies pulled up. They looked uncomfortable as soon as they realized who was involved. One of them nodded at me, said, "Hey Jack, what's going on?" I explained the situation calmly. The deputy turned to Patricia and asked if she had documentation or permits. She didn't, but she tried to bluff, saying the HOA had environmental authority under local ordinance. I stepped forward, handed him a printed copy of the federal listing for Clearwater Lake, signed and sealed from the Department of Environmental Conservation. The deputy read it, looked at her, and said, "Ma'am, this supersedes your HOA bylaws." She fumed, turned red, and said, "This isn't over, Jack." They packed up, but not before draining almost half the lake. The shorelines looked naked, exposed. The fish flopped near the edges. It broke my heart. The next morning I hiked down and checked the intake valve that fed the county's main line. The pressure gauge was barely moving. I knew what that meant. Within 24 hours the towns below would start noticing reduced flow. And they did. Calls flooded into the county office, residents complaining about low water pressure, schools reporting dry faucets, restaurants shutting down for safety reasons. The news picked it up, calling it an unexpected water main issue, but I knew exactly what caused it: Patricia Cole and her HOA's ego. The county commissioner called me personally asking for a report. I told him everything. He said, "We're sending inspectors immediately," but by the time they arrived the damage had escalated. Sediment had entered the line through the exposed intake, clogging filters downstream. It was going to take weeks to fix and thousands in repair cost. Meanwhile, Patricia and her board were pretending innocence, claiming the county's system must have been old and fragile, that their drainage effort had nothing to do with it, but the truth always leaks through just like water. I spent the next few days collecting evidence, drone footage, pictures of the equipment, invoices from the pumping company. I also found out something disturbing. The consultant she mentioned wasn't even licensed. He was her nephew, a college sophomore studying business, not engineering. She had fabricated the whole report using his name. That was my breaking point. I decided enough was enough. I wasn't going to let bureaucratic bullies destroy a resource that served thousands just to stroke their pride. I compiled everything into a detailed file and sent it to the county legal department and to the state environmental bureau. But before they could act, the HOA struck back. Patricia mailed me a notice saying I was being fined for obstruction of HOA projects, $5,000 plus additional legal fees. I laughed out loud. The audacity was unbelievable, but then I realized something darker. She wasn't after the money. She was trying to set a precedent. If I paid or even responded, she could use that as acknowledgement of HOA authority over my land. And if she succeeded there, she could push to annex the entire lake under HOA control. I called my lawyer. He confirmed my suspicion and advised me to sit tight until the state investigators arrived, but Patricia wasn't patient. She started sending maintenance teams up the access road claiming to inspect for safety compliance. I had to post no trespassing signs and install cameras. They vandalized one of them. I caught one of her board members cutting through my fence. When I confronted him, he ran. That night I sat on my porch watching the moonlight shimmer on the half-drained lake. The waterline looked wrong, unnatural and silent. The frogs had gone, the birds too. It felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. I knew what Patricia didn't. This lake wasn't just a pool, it was connected to an underground aquifer that balanced the whole region. If they tampered too much, the pressure could destabilize the bedrock, causing sinkholes or dryouts downstream. I called Tom and told him we needed to run an emergency pressure test. We spent the next morning installing temporary sensors, and within hours the readings came back scary low. We forwarded the data to the state office. They responded immediately, dispatching a field team, but the earliest they could arrive was in 2 days, and that's when Patricia made her next move. I woke up the following morning to the sound of engines again. When I looked out from the ridge, my heart sank. 3 more pump trucks, this time bigger industrial ones, had been brought in, and they were already siphoning what little remained of the lake. I raced down yelling for them to stop. Patricia stood there again, arms crossed. She said, "I warned you, Jack, you don't own nature." I said, "No, but you sure don't understand it either." The argument drew a crowd, neighbors watching from a distance, cameras rolling. Everyone could see this wasn't about safety, it was personal, and Patricia wanted to win no matter what cost. She was smiling as the pumps gurgled louder. I could see the water level drop by the minute. I begged her to stop, telling her the intake valve was going to collapse. She laughed, said, "Then we'll just rebuild it." And then it happened. A deep rumble echoed from beneath the ground. The workers froze. The water near the intake started bubbling like boiling soup. Then with a sickening crack, the earth caved in. A massive whirlpool formed, sucking the pumps and hoses down like toys. People screamed and ran. I pulled Patricia back just in time as the ground split open, leaving a gaping sinkhole 30 feet wide. The lake was gone in minutes. The silence after that was worse than the sound itself. Patricia just stood there staring at the destruction, speechless. For the first time I'd ever seen her, I said quietly, "You just drained the county's future." By that evening the county declared a state of environmental emergency. The water supply to 3 towns was critically low. Emergency tankers were being dispatched, but the damage was irreversible, at least for months. Patricia tried to spin it, claiming it was an unforeseen geological event, but everyone knew. I was called to testify the next morning before the county board. They asked for every detail, every document. I provided them all of it. They promised accountability, but deep down I knew this was only the beginning, because what the HOA didn't know yet was that draining that lake had exposed something buried beneath the silt, an old structure sealed decades ago when the dam was first built, and that discovery was about to change everything. The morning after the lake collapsed, the mountain felt like it was mourning. Silence hung heavy in the air. Even the wind seemed afraid to move. I stood at the edge of the sinkhole, staring into what used to be my lake. The water was gone, leaving behind cracked earth and twisted metal, the pumps half buried like skeletons of greed and stupidity. Patricia arrived late, her white SUV crawling up the muddy slope, headlights cutting through the mist. She stepped out in heels of all things, still pretending to be in control. "Jack," she said, her voice thin, "we need to talk." I turned slowly. The look on her face wasn't the usual arrogance, it was fear, maybe even guilt, but I wasn't ready to forgive. She tried to speak again, but I cut her off. "Talk to the county," I said. "I'm done talking to you." By noon the State Environmental Bureau had arrived. They set up barricades, drones were buzzing overhead, reporters swarmed the access road. The story had gone national. The headline read, "HOA drains protected lake triggers regional water crisis." Patricia tried to hide behind her sunglasses, but everyone knew who she was. Her perfect reputation as the community's queen bee was crumbling on live television. The inspectors found the collapsed intake valve and the cracked bedrock, and then something else buried near the lowest point of the lake, a rectangular concrete structure, old, weathered, and sealed with rusted steel plates. They asked me if I knew what it was. I told them no, but I'd seen old maps that hinted at some kind of wartime facility. The mountain had a history before the town even existed. It used to host military engineering outposts. From back in the 40s, testing tunnels and filtration systems, maybe even storage bunkers, nobody really knew. That night I sat in my cabin going through my old files. I had kept copies of the original blueprints from when I did the reinforcement project 15 years ago, and sure enough there was a small marking near the lake center labeled Auxiliary Structure B2 sealed 1951 restricted. I realized that whatever was under there had been intentionally buried when the dam was built and the lake filled over it. The next morning the investigation team began excavation. They uncovered more of the structure, and it looked bigger than expected. Reinforced walls thick enough to withstand explosions. One of the inspectors, a man named Harris, pulled me aside, said, "Jack, this isn't just some storage unit. This looks like an old filtration bunker, part of an experimental water system prototype from the Cold War era. It might still contain pressure valves, chemicals, even archives, the kind of thing that could rewrite how this whole system was designed." Meanwhile, the HOA board was imploding. 3 members resigned overnight. One even called me to apologize, saying they had no idea Patricia had lied about the permits, the consultant, and the supposed risk report. Patricia herself refused interviews, locking herself in her house, but her silence only made things worse. The state attorney announced an official investigation into the HOA for environmental negligence and tampering with public infrastructure. I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that truth was coming out, sadness that it had to come this far. 2 days later the excavation hit a door. It was sealed with a faded federal emblem. They brought in engineers in hazmat suits to open it. I watched from a distance as the doors creaked apart and a rush of stale air escaped inside. It was dark and silent until the flashlights revealed rows of old machinery, pipes, valves, and control panels untouched for decades. There were faded labels that read Clearwater Auxiliary Hydration Reserve. It was part of a prototype backup water purification system meant to activate during emergencies. I was stunned. This meant the lake wasn't just feeding the county, it was part of an old federal failsafe system. Patricia's reckless drainage had not only destroyed a water source but potentially compromised national infrastructure. Word spread fast. The news channels called it the Clearwater Bunker. The story went viral. People started demanding accountability. The governor even commented, saying that whoever authorized the drainage would face full prosecution. Patricia tried to shift the blame, claiming she had received written approval from a county liaison, but the document she showed was clearly forged. They traced the email header back to her nephew, the same fake consultant. The entire scheme was unraveling. Still, there was something more bothering me. As engineers explored the underground chamber, they found sealed drums and a separate chamber that led deeper. The sensors detected residual chemical presence, but not dangerous levels. It seemed the place had been designed to preserve water purity and regulate mineral balance. That's when one of the technicians approached me with a question. He said, "Mr. Reynolds, you might want to see this." I followed him down the stairwell into the chamber, and there it was, a large plaque, corroded but legible. It read, "Built under the Clearwater Water Preservation Act, Project 71, do not alter without federal authorization." That phrase, Preservation Act, stirred something in my memory. I rushed back home and dug through an old archive binder my late father had left me. He was an environmental engineer too. He had worked briefly on federal water projects in the 70s. I flipped through pages until I found a letter dated 1974 referencing the same act. It explained that the Clearwater system had been designed not just for county supply but as an emergency reserve for regional drought relief. It meant that this one lake wasn't just important, it was critical to the entire state's water contingency plan, and Patricia's actions might have triggered a violation of federal preservation law. I called Tom and told him everything. He was shocked, said, "Jack, if that's true, this isn't just environmental negligence, this could be classified as federal interference." He contacted the Bureau immediately. Within hours, the FBI's Environmental Crimes Division was on site. The next 48 hours were chaos. Media vans lined the roads, helicopters hovering, officials pouring in. Patricia was nowhere to be seen. Her house had police tape across it. Turns out she had tried to destroy evidence, emails, financial records showing she funneled HOA funds into her nephew's fake consultancy account. She was arrested 2 days later, attempting to leave town, charged with multiple counts including falsifying environmental data, unauthorized use of public resources, and obstruction of federal investigation. But the victory felt hollow because the lake was still gone. Even with the bunker discovered, the aquifer pressure was collapsing. The county was relying on emergency reserves and bottled water distribution for thousands. I worked with the engineers trying to draft a restoration plan, but the mountain was unstable. We couldn't just refill the basin without risking another collapse. One night while running tests, I noticed something strange. One of the deeper monitoring stations near the ridge was still reading water pressure consistent with underground flow. That didn't make sense unless there was a secondary outlet. I followed the trail through old maps and found something remarkable. There was a secondary vent system that ran beneath the north ridge, leading to an older spring that had been capped off decades ago. I realized if we could reopen that channel, we could gradually refill the lake safely and restore natural balance. I presented the idea to the Bureau. They were skeptical at first, but after reviewing my data they agreed to let me lead the pilot operation. We gathered a small team of geologists and hydrologists and started drilling near the ridge using minimal impact tools. The first few days nothing happened, but then on the 5th day we heard a faint hiss of air escaping followed by a trickle of water. It worked, the aquifer was still alive. The moment that first stream of water broke through, everyone cheered. It wasn't much, but it was hope. Over the next few weeks the trickle grew into a steady flow. The lake bed began to darken again, mud turning to wet soil, nature slowly reclaiming what arrogance had stolen. The frogs came back, the birds followed, and one morning I stood at the same spot where the sinkhole had formed and saw the reflection of the sunrise in a shallow pool. I can't describe that feeling. It was like watching the mountain breathe again. But the battle wasn't over. The HOA was still technically active under temporary management. Some members wanted to dissolve it entirely, others wanted to rebuild it properly under state oversight. I didn't care as long as they stayed away from the lake. Patricia meanwhile faced her trial. She pleaded not guilty, claiming she had been misled by consultants, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every forged signature, every payment record, every ignored warning, it was all there. I testified in court not out of spite but out of duty. The judge listened carefully, and when the verdict came it was swift. Guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison with no chance of HOA involvement ever again. The community began to heal. Neighbors who had once followed her blindly now came to me asking how they could help restore the area. Together we started the Clearwater Restoration Initiative, planting trees, rebuilding trails, reintroducing local fish species. The county declared the region a protected conservation zone under joint management with the State Bureau. I was appointed as technical advisor not because of politics but because I had lived and breathed that mountain for years. One afternoon months later, as I sat by the newly forming lake, I heard footsteps. It was Tom carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He sat beside me quietly. We watched the ripples spread across the water. He said, "You know, Jack, if she hadn't done what she did we might never have discovered that bunker or saved the aquifer." I nodded. Sometimes disaster reveals what comfort hides, I said. He laughed, said, "Maybe you should run the HOA now." I smiled, not a chance. As the sun dipped behind the peaks painting the water gold, I realized the mountain had forgiven us slowly, patiently, like nature always does, and even though the scars would remain, they were proof that sometimes it takes destruction to remind people what truly matters, not control, not power, but respect for the world that sustains us. But just as I thought peace had finally returned, a call came in from one of the engineers monitoring the restoration. Sensors were picking up irregular fluctuations deep under the newly sealed bunker, pressure levels rising again. Something was shifting below the ground, something we hadn't seen before. Tom looked at me worried. I said, "It's probably residual pressure." He said, "Maybe, but the readings are climbing faster than expected." I stood there staring at the calm water, realizing maybe the lake wasn't done with us yet. Maybe the mountain had more secrets buried beneath its surface waiting to be uncovered, and if those sensors were right, what came next might be even bigger than the first collapse. The night the sensors spiked I couldn't sleep. The soft hum of the monitoring equipment echoed through my cabin like a heartbeat. The readings showed steady pressure building beneath the new lake bed, deeper than the old reservoir line. It didn't make sense. The aquifer was supposed to be stabilizing, not surging. I stared at the numbers flashing across the screen, wondering if nature was warning us again, or if we had awakened something that had been resting too long. By morning I called Tom, told him to meet me at the site. We hiked down the ridge and stood by the edge of the still shallow lake, mist curling across the surface. The air felt heavier than usual. A faint vibration trembled through the ground, not strong enough to be dangerous, but enough to raise hairs on the back of my neck. The water shimmered in slow ripples like something moving beneath it. We set up additional sensors deeper into the soil and drilled a small borehole to measure gas release. Within minutes we detected traces of methane and trapped air pockets, which was odd because the aquifer's geology didn't support that kind of buildup unless there was an enclosed cavern underneath. I remembered the sealed section of the old bunker, the one we never fully explored. Maybe the pressure was coming from there. That afternoon the State Bureau arrived again, curious and cautious. They authorized a subsurface scan. The images came back with something unexpected. Below the sealed section was a massive chamber, not on any of the maps. It stretched under the northern ridge, at least 100 feet deep, perfectly symmetrical like a constructed vault. The engineers debated theories, maybe a water reservoir, maybe storage from the old Project 71 system, but nobody knew for sure. They decided to send a small robotic probe through one of the old access vents. The footage it sent back was haunting. The chamber walls were smooth metal lined with old markings and faded insignias, and at the center was a large cylindrical structure half submerged in sediment. One of the technicians gasped, saying, "That looks like a containment unit." Within hours the area was locked down. The Bureau called in federal specialists from environmental safety and historical preservation. I watched from a distance as hazmat trucks rolled and the officials whispered among themselves, clearly worried about what they had uncovered. Later that evening an agent approached me asking about my involvement and knowledge of the project. I told him everything about the blueprints, the Preservation Act, and how we found the bunker. He nodded, said, "Mr. Reynolds, you may have just unearthed a classified facility. We'll need your cooperation, but this investigation will be federal from here." For the next few days the site became restricted, even I wasn't allowed in, but curiosity gnawed at me. I stayed close, working with Tom on stabilizing the aquifer while keeping an eye on the new activity. Guards patrolled the perimeter and drones hovered above at night. Lights glowed from the tents below like fireflies over the wounded mountain. 3 days later the pressure readings suddenly dropped, then stabilized again. Whatever was causing the buildup had been neutralized or contained. I thought maybe they'd vented the chamber, but then the next morning a convoy of black vehicles arrived and the lead agent approached me saying, "We'd like to thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Reynolds, but this matter is now under federal confidentiality. We appreciate your discretion." That was government language for don't ask questions. Still, I couldn't help myself. I said, "Is it dangerous?" He paused, looked around, then said, "Let's just say your HOA incident prevented something far worse. If that lake hadn't drained when it did, we might never have found what was buried there." I stared at him confused. He continued, "The Clearwater system wasn't just water preservation, it was also used for early experiments in geological containment during the Cold War era. Certain materials were stored below as part of classified studies. When the facility was sealed, the data was lost, and over time everyone forgot, but if that structure had remained under high pressure any longer, it could have ruptured the aquifer completely. You may have saved more than the county, Jack. You might have saved the entire region." I stood there speechless. The irony hit me like a wave. Patricia's destruction had caused unimaginable damage, but it had also uncovered a buried danger decades old, and by reacting fast we prevented something catastrophic. I asked if it was radioactive. He smiled slightly, said, "Nothing of that level, but enough to destabilize natural water chemistry. Now it's contained and safe." The agent thanked me again and left, leaving me alone with the sound of wind and trickling water. The lake was slowly refilling, stronger than before, clearer too, as if the mountain was purging itself, starting fresh. I realized that maybe this was the mountain's way of balancing justice. Nature has its own law beyond courts and councils. Months passed. The Clearwater Restoration Initiative grew into a full environmental program. Volunteers, scientists, and locals working side by side, rebuilding trails, installing monitoring systems, planting new trees and aquatic plants. For the first time in years I saw families hiking again, children laughing by the shoreline. It felt alive again. The scars were still visible, the edges of the sinkhole now forming a small natural cove, but that only made it more beautiful. Tom and I were officially recognized by the state for our contribution. They even named a new observatory point after my late father, the Reynolds View. It overlooked the lake from the south ridge. I'd go there often to watch sunsets, thinking about how fragile yet powerful nature truly was. One act of ignorance nearly destroyed it, but persistence restored it. Then one afternoon, while checking the new filtration inlet, I saw something half buried in mud, a small metallic plaque, broken and rusted. I wiped it clean and read the faint engraving. It said, "Project Clearwater Restoration Phase 2, authorized 1975, Federal Reserve Division," meaning the facility wasn't just one site, it was part of multiple linked systems across the region, and if this was Phase 2 there could be more hidden reservoirs elsewhere. I brought it to the Bureau. They were stunned. After cross-referencing data, they discovered similar geological patterns in 3 other counties. It seemed the Clearwater network was an unfinished dream of a larger preservation system meant to protect against drought and contamination. Decades before modern systems existed, the discovery sparked new research and funding. The government officially classified the region as a national water heritage zone, ensuring no private organization, including HOAs, could ever interfere again. As for the old HOA, it was dissolved permanently. Property management transferred to county supervision. The homes once obsessed with uniform fences and perfect lawns now coexisted with the raw mountain landscape, unpolished but real. A few residents who once worshipped Patricia's leadership now joined the restoration team, planting trees where pumps once stood. I thought that was the end, but fate has a way of reminding us that every story leaves echoes. One evening, while reviewing the last batch of geological readings, I noticed faint pulses coming from a deeper section beneath the lake, barely detectable, almost rhythmic like a heartbeat. Tom joked, "Maybe the mountain's alive." I laughed, said, "Maybe it always was, we just never listened." That night as I sat on my porch, the air was still, the lake mirrored the stars above, and for a brief moment it felt like time stopped. I realized how far we'd come from the day they drained it. Arrogance replaced by understanding, division replaced by unity. The HOA had fallen, but the community had risen stronger. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from the Federal Bureau, stamped confidential. Inside was a simple note thanking me again for my role in uncovering and preserving the Clearwater system. Attached was a clearance badge granting me special access to oversee regional conservation projects under their new initiative. At the bottom was one handwritten line from the agent we met months ago. It said, "Sometimes to save something precious you have to break what hides it first." I placed the letter on my desk and looked out the window. The lake glimmered silver under the moonlight, peaceful, vast, and eternal, and I knew this wasn't just my home anymore. It was a legacy, a living reminder of what happens when power clashes with nature and loses. Years later, the Clearwater Lake became a case study taught in universities' environmental law and engineering programs, using it as a model for crisis response and ecological recovery. I was invited to speak once, standing before a room full of young students eager to change the world. I told them this story not with bitterness but with hope. I said, "Remember, water remembers. Every action you take returns to you like ripples on A lake, so choose what kind you want to send out. After the seminar, a young woman approached me. She said her grandfather used to work on Project 71 back in the 40s and that he always believed it would one day save lives. She thanked me for proving him right. I smiled, told her the credit belongs to the mountain. I just listened. Now every morning I walk down to the shore, coffee in hand, watching mist rise from the water, and I think about how strange life is. The HOA tried to control everything but lost it all because they never understood you can't own nature, you can only coexist with it, respect it, or it will humble you, and when it humbles you it doesn't whisper, it roars. The mountain taught me that the hard way, and maybe that's how it should be, because peace without humility is just arrogance waiting for its fall. I built a small bench near the cove engraved with a single line in memory of what we learned. It says, "Let the water flow." And that's what I do. I let it flow, watching the lake heal itself day by day, knowing that no matter what happens next, the clear water will endure beyond laws, beyond greed, beyond time itself. A mirror to remind us all that nature always writes the final chapter. When the HOA drained my mountain lake, saying it was a flood risk, they didn't know they were cutting off water for the entire county. I warned them, but they laughed, said it's just a pond. But that pond fed every home, every school, every life for miles, and when they pulled those pumps, the taps ran dry. Within a day the whole county shut down. Then the ground cracked open, swallowing their machines, exposing a hidden Cold War bunker buried beneath the lake, and suddenly the HOA's little power trip turned into a federal investigation. What they destroyed revealed a secret system built to save our region from drought, and their arrogance nearly wiped it out forever. Now the HOA's gone, the mountain's healing, and the lake's alive again. Nature doesn't need revenge, it just waits for you to destroy yourself. Like and subscribe for more crazy HOA stories.